This presentation details historical events involving mass death and extreme psychological distress. Viewer discretion is advised. Imagine stepping out of your front door into the sweltering heat of a July morning. The air is thick, the cobblestone streets are quiet, but then you see it. A lone figure in the town square. A woman, your neighbor, and she is dancing. There is no music, no festival, no joy on her face. Her eyes are wide, glassy, and fixed on something no one else can see. Her movements are frantic, jerky, a puppet pulled by invisible strings. She twists, she spins, she flails her arms, her bare feet slapping against the stone, again and again and again. This is not a dance of celebration. It is a dance of agony. This was the sight that greeted the citizens of Strasbourg in the Holy Roman Empire in the year 1518. The woman was Frau Trophia, and for 6 straight days she did not stop. Her husband begged her. He pleaded. He grabbed her by the arms, trying to hold her still, but her body thrashed with a strength he didn't recognize. Neighbors gathered, first in curiosity, then in fear. They watched as her feet became swollen and bloodied, as her clothes became tattered and soaked with sweat. She collapsed from exhaustion, her body trembling on the ground, only to rise moments later and resume the same tormented, silent dance. She was a prisoner in her own body. And then the true horror began. Within a week, another person joined her, then a dozen more. Soon 34 people were dancing in the streets, day and night. They were not dancing with each other. They were each trapped in their own private nightmare, their bodies convulsing to a rhythm only they could hear. Within a month, the number had swollen to 400. 400 men, women, and children, their bodies jerking uncontrollably under the summer sun. The city descended into a waking nightmare. The screams of pain and exhaustion echoed through the narrow streets. The city's authorities were paralyzed with fear. What was this? A divine punishment? A new horrifying plague? Or something far, far worse? They called in the physicians, the most learned men of the age. After careful observation, they dismissed any astrological or supernatural causes. Their diagnosis was as bizarre as the affliction itself. This was a natural disease, caused by hot blood. And their prescribed cure would prove to be one of the most catastrophic medical decisions in history. They believed the dancers needed to sweat the fever out. The cure, they declared, was not to stop the dancing, but to encourage it. This is the story of the dancing plague of 1518. A story you might think you know. For centuries, the official explanation has been simple: a case of mass hysteria, or perhaps poisoning from a fungus called ergot that grows on rye bread. These are neat, tidy explanations for an event that was anything but. They are comfortable lies that paper over a truth so disturbing, it was deliberately buried. Because the real story isn't just about the people who danced. It's about the world that made them dance. To understand what happened, you have to understand the world of 1518. And it was a world teetering on the brink of apocalypse. Strasbourg on the surface was a prosperous city, a jewel of the Alsace region, nestled on the Rhine River. But beneath that surface, it was a pressure cooker of misery. The preceding winter had been brutal, one of the coldest in a generation. It was followed by a late frost that killed the vines and a summer of hailstorms and drought that decimated the wheat and rye crops. The result was a catastrophic famine. The price of grain skyrocketed. The city's chronicles from that year are filled with grim reports of starving families. The poor were eating boiled leather, ground-up husks, and even dirt to survive. Orphanages overflowed. People were selling their children, their homes, anything for a loaf of bread that was more sawdust than flour. Despair was a physical presence in the city, a hunger so deep it gnawed not just at the stomach, but at the soul. And where there is famine, disease is never far behind. The early 16th century was a golden age for death. Smallpox, leprosy, and syphilis were rampant. But a new terrifying illness had recently swept across Europe: the English sweating sickness. It was a disease that could kill a perfectly healthy person in a matter of hours. You would be fine at breakfast and dead by dinner. Its cause was unknown, its cure non-existent. It created a pervasive, ambient terror that life could be extinguished in an instant, without reason or warning. Every cough, every fever, every bead of sweat was a potential death sentence. Into this cauldron of starvation and disease, you must add the most powerful force of the age: religion. This was not the abstract faith of the modern world. This was a raw, visceral belief in a God of wrath and judgment. Every famine, every plague was seen as a direct punishment for humanity's sins. The devil and his demons were not metaphors. They were real, tangible entities that could possess the weak and torment the wicked. And the people of Strasbourg had a special reason to be afraid. Just a few decades earlier, a local bishop had declared that if the people did not repent their sins of vanity, gambling, and blasphemy, God would send a plague upon them that would force them to dance in madness until they died. The prophecy was well known. It was a story told to frighten children, and now it seemed to be coming true. Adding to this spiritual anxiety was the fact that the very foundations of their faith were cracking. Just 1 year earlier, a German monk named Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to a church door, igniting the firestorm that would become the Protestant Reformation. The absolute authority of the Catholic Church, the only authority these people had ever known, was being challenged. The world was turning upside down. The old certainties were melting away, replaced by confusion, conflict, and a profound sense of spiritual dread. So this is Strasbourg in July of 1518. Starving, sick, and terrified that God had abandoned them. It is a city primed for a spark to ignite the powder keg of collective misery. And that spark was Frau Trophia, dancing alone in the square. Now remember the doctor's fatal prescription: more dancing. The city's powerful guilds and the ruling council took this advice to heart. They believed they were acting with compassion, with the best medical science of their day. So they didn't quarantine the dancers. They didn't restrain them. Instead, they leaned in. They cleared out the city's largest indoor spaces, the guild halls, to give the afflicted more room. When that wasn't enough, they made an even more astonishing decision. They ordered the horse market, one of the main public squares, to be cleared. They boarded up the surrounding shops. And in the center of the square, they constructed a large wooden stage. They didn't just give the dancers a venue. They gave them a soundtrack. The city council hired dozens of pipers, drummers, and fiddlers to play music around the clock. They even hired healthy, professional dancers to join the afflicted on the stage, to keep them moving, to encourage them, believing this constant motion would burn away the sickness. They turned a horrifying plague into a public spectacle, a macabre festival. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of people, their bodies writhing, their faces contorted in masks of pain, dancing on a purpose-built stage. Below them, a crowd of thousands gathers to watch. Musicians play upbeat, festive tunes, a grotesque counterpoint to the suffering in front of them. The sun beats down. The dancers' feet are torn to shreds. Their bodies are dehydrated, their minds long gone. They are not dancing anymore. They are simply being shaken by a force they cannot control. And one by one, their hearts begin to give out. They collapse from strokes, from dehydration, from sheer absolute exhaustion. They were quite literally being danced to death. And it was all being orchestrated by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The cure had become the execution. To understand this brutal state-sanctioned prescription, you have to crawl inside the mind of a 16th century physician. You have to forget everything you know about germs, viruses, and modern medicine, and instead embrace a world governed by 4 essential fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These were the 4 humors, the very essence of life and health. To the doctors of Strasbourg, and indeed all of Europe, every sickness, every ailment from a common cold to the Black Plague, was simply an imbalance of these humors. A person with too much phlegm was sluggish and cold, too much black bile, and they became melancholic. So when Frau Trophia and the dozens who followed her began their frantic, unending dance, the city's finest medical minds gathered, stroked their beards, and came to a diagnosis that, to them, was perfectly logical. This wasn't a spiritual affliction. It wasn't a curse. It was a natural disease. A disease caused by an excess of hot blood. Their blood had literally become overheated. They reasoned, boiling up in their brains and limbs, forcing them into this feverish, manic state. It was an entirely physical problem, and therefore it required a physical solution. The logic that followed was as simple as it was catastrophic. If the problem is too much of something, the only cure is to get it out. If you have too much hot blood, you must burn it off. You must sweat it out. You must exhaust it from the body. And what better way to do that than through continuous, strenuous physical exertion? The prescription was unanimous. The dancers must not be restrained. They must be encouraged to dance. They must, in fact, be forced to dance day and night without rest, until the hot blood was purged from their systems and the humoral balance was restored. They had to dance the fever out. This wasn't a half-hearted suggestion. It was official city policy, enacted with terrifying efficiency. The Strasbourg City Council, led by the powerful guilds, took immediate and decisive action. They ordered public spaces to be cleared. The sprawling grain market and the crowded horse market were emptied of their vendors and transformed into vast, open-air dance floors. They wanted to give the afflicted ample room to spin and jerk and flail, to literally work the disease out of their bodies under the hot July sun. But they didn't stop there. This was to be an organized therapeutic event. In a move that is almost impossible to comprehend today, the city authorities ordered the construction of a large wooden stage. They built it right in the heart of the city, directly in front of the towering, ornate cathedral. This wasn't some back-alley madness. This was a public spectacle, sanctioned at the highest level, taking place in the most sacred and central spot in Strasbourg. The stage was for the dancers, a platform to showcase their suffering as a form of public healing. And to ensure the cure was administered effectively, they needed to keep the dancers moving. They needed a constant driving rhythm. So the city hired professional musicians. Dozens of them. Drummers were brought in to pound out relentless, hypnotic beats. Pipers and fiddlers were paid to play energetic, non-stop melodies. These weren't the somber tones of a funeral dirge. This was loud, lively, and incessant music, echoing through the cobblestone streets 24 hours a day. Imagine the scene. It's the middle of the night. You're trying to sleep, but through your window comes the endless, maddening sound of a drum, the shrill cry of a pipe, and the rhythmic slapping sound of hundreds of bare, bloody feet on stone and wood. The healthy citizens of Strasbourg watched on, a mixture of horror and morbid fascination twisting their faces. They saw their neighbors, their friends, their family members with wild, unfocused eyes, their bodies slick with sweat and grime. Their clothes were torn, their faces gaunt and skeletal. They saw people whose feet were worn down to bloody stumps, who were still being urged on by the cheerful music and the stern-faced guards hired by the city to prevent anyone from stopping. The musicians themselves would sometimes collapse from exhaustion, only to be replaced by a fresh set, ensuring the music never ever stopped. This wasn't a party. It was a torture chamber disguised as a festival. The dancers weren't moving with joy. They were puppets, their limbs jerking to a rhythm they couldn't control, their faces masks of pure agony. They would cry out for mercy, beg for a moment of rest, plead for a sip of water. But the official prescription was clear. To stop was to let the hot blood settle and fester. The cure required constant motion. So they were prodded onward, kept on their feet, forced back into the writhing mass when they tried to crawl away. And then the cure began to claim its victims. One by one, the dancers began to fall. A man in his 40s, a baker well known in the community, suddenly clutched his chest, his eyes rolling back in his head as a massive heart attack stilled his frantic limbs forever. A young woman, no older than 16, collapsed in a heap, her body succumbing to a violent stroke, the relentless motion finally shattering the blood vessels in her brain. Others simply dropped from sheer exhaustion, their hearts giving out. Dehydration, starvation, and heatstroke claimed dozens more. Their bodies would be unceremoniously dragged from the dance floor to make room for the others, the music barely pausing to acknowledge their passing. The death toll, at first a trickle, became a flood. Contemporary accounts claim that at the peak of the plague, as many as 15 people were dying each day. 15 families shattered. 15 bodies added to the city's morgue, all victims of a prescribed cure. The city's leadership, the physicians and the guild masters, watched from the sidelines. At first, they likely saw these deaths as a tragic but necessary cost. The disease was strong, they would have told themselves. The weakest among them were simply not able to purge the poison. The cure was working, but the sickness was just too powerful for some. But as the days turned into a week, and the week turned into two, the confidence of the city's elite began to fray. The number of dancers wasn't decreasing, it was increasing. For every person who died, it seemed two more joined the macabre marathon. The cure wasn't curing anything. It was acting as an accelerant, a brutally efficient method of turning a bizarre affliction into a death sentence. The stage they had built was not a place of healing. It was an altar of sacrifice. The relentless music was not a therapeutic tool. It was a funeral march. Panic began to creep into the halls of power. Their confident, scientific diagnosis of hot blood was failing spectacularly. Their perfectly logical, physical solution was resulting in a pile of corpses that grew higher with every sunrise. They had been so certain, so assured in their modern rational approach. But their rationality was killing people. They had to face a terrifying possibility. What if they were wrong? What if this wasn't a natural disease of the humors at all? As the physicians of Strasbourg stared at their catastrophic failure, a new, far more terrifying explanation began to whisper its way through the terrified city. An explanation that turned their eyes away from the medical texts and towards the heavens. If this wasn't a sickness of the blood, then it had to be a sickness of the soul. If this wasn't a problem that could be solved by man, then it must have been sent by something far greater. The city leaders, in their desperation, abandoned the science of the day and embraced a much older, much more primal fear. This wasn't a plague. It was a punishment, a divine curse sent down by an angry God. And if you're being punished by God, you don't hire more musicians. You pray for forgiveness. And so the music stopped. The stages were dismantled. The guild halls, once echoing with frantic drum beats, fell silent. The city council, their grand experiment in public health and abysmal failure, turned their backs on the physicians and their theories of hot blood. They turned to the priests, because in the mind of early 16th century Europe, when the logical fails, the supernatural is all that's left. The diagnosis was no longer chorea, a disease of the body. It was demonic possession, a spiritual sickness, a holy curse. And for a curse like this, there was only one name that sent a shiver down every spine in that part of the world. Saint Vitus. Who was Saint Vitus? To the people of Strasbourg, he wasn't just a figure from a dusty book. He was a terrifying reality, a child martyr from Sicily, executed by the Romans centuries earlier. Legend had it that he had the power to inflict a terrible curse upon sinners and blasphemers, a curse of uncontrollable, convulsive dancing. For generations, mothers had warned their children, "Be good, or Saint Vitus will make you dance." It was the boogeyman of restless limbs. The term Saint Vitus's dance was already a known, feared phenomenon across the Holy Roman Empire, a catch-all term for any neurological disorder they couldn't explain. And now, it seemed the saint had come to collect a debt from the entire city of Strasbourg. The new plan was born not of medicine, but of pure, unadulterated fear. The dancers were to be rounded up, not for treatment but for penance. They were to be taken on a forced pilgrimage to the one place powerful enough to appease the wrathful saint, his shrine. But this wasn't a grand cathedral in a neighboring city. It was a remote, isolated cave chapel, high in the Vosges Mountains near the town of Saverne, a place of cold stone and desperate faith. The city, in its terror, decided to physically cast out its demons. Imagine the scene. The remaining dancers, now numbering over 100, are herded into wagons. These are not people anymore. They are effigies of a divine punishment. Their bodies are skeletal, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed, but their limbs still jerk and flail with that relentless, unnatural energy. Their feet, wrapped in bloody rags, twitch against the wooden floorboards. They are too weak to stand, but they cannot stop moving. As the wagons rumble over the cobblestones, a grim parade of the damned, the healthy citizens of Strasbourg watch from their windows. They don't cheer. They don't offer comfort. They pull their shutters closed and bolt their doors, praying the curse leaves with the afflicted. This wasn't an act of compassion. It was an exorcism of the entire city. They were sending their nightmare away, hoping it would die in the mountains. The journey itself was an ordeal. Days of rattling on rough-hewn roads, under the relentless August sun. There was little food or water. The guards hired to escort them were terrified, treating their human cargo like caged, rabid animals. How many died on the way? The records don't say. But we can imagine the horror. A person finally succumbing to exhaustion, their heart giving out in the back of a wagon, their body still twitching faintly even in death. When they finally arrived at the shrine, they were dragged from the carts and brought into the cold, damp grotto. Light struggled to pierce the gloom, illuminating a crude wooden statue of Saint Vitus. Here the final desperate ritual began. The priests, robed and solemn, chanted in Latin, the words echoing off the wet stone walls. They sprinkled the dancers with holy water, which must have felt like ice on their feverish skin. Then came the most bizarre part of the ritual. They placed small red shoes on the dancers' feet. Red, the color of martyrdom, the color of blood. They were made to dance before the statue of the saint, a final forced performance for their divine tormentor. A mass was held. Incense, thick and cloying, filled the small cave, mingling with the smell of sweat, sickness, and desperation. For the dancers, this was the ultimate psychological shock. They had been starved, dehydrated, marched to the brink of death, and now they were in a dark, cold cave surrounded by chanting priests, being told they were possessed. They were at the absolute lowest point of human endurance. And for some, this brutal, terrifying shock therapy actually worked. The sheer overwhelming force of the ritual, the belief that a divine power was intervening, may have been enough to break the psychological loop of the hysteria. Like a switch being flipped, some of the dancers simply collapsed. The frantic energy left their bodies, and they fell to the stone floor, finally blessedly still. They were not healed, they were broken, but they were no longer dancing. Chroniclers of the time, like the physician Paracelsus who studied the event years later, noted that this pilgrimage seemed to be the cure that finally had some effect. But it was a cure born of brutality, and it was far from a miracle. While some ceased their convulsions, many did not. They kept dancing in that cold, dark cave until their bodies gave out. Others, weakened beyond recovery by the journey and the ordeal, simply died there at the foot of the statue. The shrine of St. Vitus was not a place of healing. It was a filter. It separated those who could be shocked out of their state from those who were already too far gone. The survivors, gaunt and traumatized, were eventually sent back to Strasbourg. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief. The wagons returned, emptier than when they left. The curse had been appeased. The nightmare they believed was over. They had faced the wrath of God, performed their penance, and survived. The remaining weeks of August were quiet. The streets were still. The silence was a comfort, a sign that normalcy was returning. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed the plague was a sickness carried only within the bodies of those 100 or so dancers. They had treated the symptom, but they had never once understood the cause. They had exiled the dancers, but they had not exiled the fear. And the fear was still there, festering in the summer heat, lurking behind every bolted door and shuttered window in Strasbourg. The stage had been cleared, but the play was far from over. The city was holding its breath, waiting for a deliverance that would never come, because what was about to happen in September would make the horror of the past month look like a prelude. The real plague was just about to begin. The city's grand experiment, its prescribed cure of more dancing, had not just failed, it had backfired in the most catastrophic way imaginable. By September, Strasbourg was no longer a city with a strange affliction. It was a charnel house. The stages erected in the grain market and the horse market were no longer platforms of healing. They were altars of sacrifice. The air, once filled with the forced gaiety of pipes and drums, now carried a different sound. A ghastly symphony of cracking bones, ragged, desperate gasps for air, and the low, constant moan of absolute exhaustion. The strong men hired to hold the dancers upright were now, more often than not, simply carrying corpses off the blood-slicked planks. The dancers themselves were barely recognizable as human. Their faces were skeletal masks of sun-scorched leather stretched tight over bone. Their eyes, wide and unseeing, were sunk deep into their skulls. Their clothing was in tatters, their feet and legs were shredded, swollen masses of infected wounds, wrapped in bloody rags. Yet they danced. The compulsion, the invisible puppeteer, had not released its grip. They jerked and twitched, their movements becoming more spastic, more violent, as their bodies literally fell apart. The physicians who had so confidently prescribed this madness were now nowhere to be seen. They had retreated into the shadows, their theory of hot blood, dissolving in the face of a reality far more horrifying than any textbook could describe. The city council, the powerful guild masters of the Magistrate of 21, were in a state of pure, unadulterated panic. Their solution had poured gasoline on a fire. They had taken a bizarre, localized phenomenon and, through their own misguided intervention, nurtured it into a full-blown epidemic of death. They had built the very stage upon which their city was dying. How could they have been so wrong? The question hung over the council chambers like a shroud. This was clearly not an issue of overheated blood. This was something else. Something older, darker. In their desperation, their minds, steeped in the superstitions and fervent piety of the 16th century, turned away from the physical and towards the metaphysical. They looked away from the body and towards the soul. This wasn't a disease. This was a punishment. A new diagnosis began to whisper its way through the halls of power, a conclusion born not of medicine, but of terror and faith. This was a divine curse. God himself, or perhaps one of his more vengeful saints, had laid a heavy hand upon Strasbourg for its sins. Pride, avarice, lust, blasphemy, the city was surely guilty of them all. This dancing, this horrifying, endless St. Vitus dance, was their penance, writ large in the public square for all the world to see. The name of St. Vitus was not chosen at random. To the people of that time, he was a figure of immense and terrifying duality. Vitus was a young Sicilian boy martyred in the 4th century under the Roman Emperor Diocletian. According to legend, he was boiled in a cauldron of oil but emerged unharmed, a testament to his faith. Over the centuries, his legend grew, and through a strange twist of folklore, he became the patron saint of dancers, actors, and entertainers. People would dance wildly before his statue on his feast day to ensure a year of good health. But there was a darker side to his patronage. If you angered St. Vitus, if you blasphemed on his feast day or failed to show him proper respect, it was believed he could inflict a terrible curse, the very dancing he was meant to bless. He could force you into a frantic, uncontrollable mania, a chorea that would not stop until you collapsed or died. All across the Holy Roman Empire, from Germany to Latvia, the fear of the St. Vitus dance was real. And now, the leaders of Strasbourg were convinced it had come to their city. This new diagnosis demanded a new cure, a complete 180-degree reversal of their previous strategy. If the plague was a holy curse, then worldly medicine was useless. Worse, their prescribed cure, the music, the revelry, the public spectacle, was an insult to God. It was like trying to put out a divine fire with barrels of oil. They had been encouraging the very sin that was damning them. The decree came down like a hammer blow. It was swift, absolute, and brutal. Effective immediately, all music was banned within the walls of Strasbourg. The pipes and drums were to fall silent. The minstrels who had been paid by the city to play day and night were run out of town, their wages unpaid, lucky to escape with their lives. Public dancing of any kind, unless for religious reasons, was now a crime. The great guild halls, the sites of so much feasting and celebration, were ordered shut. The bloody stages in the town squares were to be torn down, the wood carted away as if it were infected itself. In the span of a day, Strasbourg went from a city of forced, manic noise to one of enforced, terrified silence. The only sound left was the rhythmic, shuffling scrape of the dancers' ruined feet on the cobblestones. The city was holding its breath, praying that this austerity, this solemn piety, would appease the wrathful saint. But what of the afflicted themselves? They couldn't simply be left to die in the streets. The new plan, guided by this spiritual diagnosis, was even more radical. The dancers were now seen as vessels of the curse, living symbols of the city's sin. They had to be cleansed. They had to seek forgiveness directly from the source of their torment. They had to be taken to St. Vitus himself. High in the Vosges Mountains, a day's journey from the city, lay a remote, rugged shrine dedicated to the saint. It was a cave, a grotto, said to hold a relic of St. Vitus. For generations, people had made pilgrimages there seeking cures for nervous afflictions, for epilepsy, for the very dancing plague that now held Strasbourg in its grip. It was a place of last resort, a final desperate appeal to the divine. And so the final cruel phase of the city's intervention began. The remaining dancers, dozens upon dozens of them, were rounded up. These were people in the final stages of starvation and exhaustion, their bodies ravaged, their minds long since shattered. They were herded together, their twitching, jerking bodies loaded unceremoniously onto wagons. Families were separated. Husbands watched as their wives were taken. Parents watched their children being carted away, unable to do anything but pray. This was not a gentle procession. It was an expulsion. The city was cutting out the diseased flesh, casting off its sin and sending it into the wilderness. The plan was to take them to the mountain shrine, have them pray before the altar, make an offering, and hope that St. Vitus would see fit to lift his curse. Each dancer was given a pair of red shoes, a bizarre detail mentioned in the historical chronicles. Perhaps it was a symbol of their penance, the color of martyrdom, or perhaps an offering to the saint. Imagine that scene. A train of rumbling wagons piled high with the living dead, lurching out of the city gates, leaving behind a silent, traumatized populace who could only watch and wonder if this desperate pilgrimage was an act of salvation, or simply a more organized way of sending their loved ones to their deaths. As the wagons disappeared into the forests carpeting the foothills of the mountains, a new and terrible question settled over Strasbourg. What exactly was waiting for them in that dark, cold cave? And would any of them ever come back? The answer began to form on the brutal, jolting journey north. The wagons were not chariots of salvation. They were simple farm carts, their wooden wheels groaning over the rutted dirt tracks leading out of Strasbourg. Inside, the dancers were a writhing, chaotic mass of humanity. They weren't sitting. They couldn't. They were still dancing, their bodies contorting in the cramped spaces, limbs flailing, knocking against the hard wooden sides of the carts and against each other. The motion of the wagons added a sickening, lurching rhythm to their endless movements. For the families following on foot, it was a vision from a nightmare. They watched the people they loved, their wives, husbands, sons, and daughters, jerk and twitch like puppets on a string, their faces vacant, their eyes glazed over with a mixture of exhaustion and sheer terror. The air grew colder as they ascended into the Vosges Mountains. The dense, dark forest seemed to swallow the sound of the creaking wheels and the rhythmic thudding of bare feet against wood. Every so often, a dancer would collapse, their body finally giving out. There was no ceremony. They were simply pulled from the cart and left by the side of the road, a grim marker on this pilgrimage of the damned. The living just kept dancing, oblivious. They were beyond hunger, beyond thirst, beyond pain. They were instruments of some terrible, unseen orchestra, and the music had not yet stopped. After days of this torturous travel, they arrived. The shrine of St. Vitus was not a grand, soaring cathedral. It was a grotto, a damp and shadowy cave carved into the mountainside, a place that felt older than Christianity itself. A raw, primal energy seemed to hum in the air. This was a place of ancient worship, now draped in the symbols of a new faith. Priests in dark robes met the procession, their faces grim, holding flickering torches that cast long, dancing shadows against the wet stone walls. They had been expecting them. News of the plague traveled fast. The dancers were hauled from the wagons, their bodies slick with sweat despite the mountain chill. They stumbled onto the cold ground before the cave, but their feet did not stop. They danced on the mud and sharp rocks, their movements as frenzied as ever. This was the moment of truth, the city council's last, desperate gamble. They had tried music and stages, and that had failed. Now they would try God. Specifically, they would try St. Vitus. But why him? Who was this saint, this figure they believed held the power to stop this living nightmare? The answer lies centuries earlier, in the Roman Empire under the reign of Diocletian, a time of brutal persecution for the fledgling Christian faith. Vitus was just a boy, perhaps only 7 or 12 years old, the son of a pagan senator in Sicily. Converted to Christianity by his tutors, his faith was so profound that he was said to perform miracles. When his own father couldn't beat the faith out of him, he handed him over to the authorities. The legend of St. Vitus is a gruesome catalogue of torture. He was thrown into a cauldron of boiling oil and molten lead, but emerged unscathed. He was cast into a pit of lions, but they refused to harm him, instead licking his feet like house cats. Finally, in the year 303, he was martyred. But it's what happened in the centuries after his death that connects him to the horror unfolding in Strasbourg. Throughout the Middle Ages, particularly in Germanic lands, a tradition emerged. On the feast day of St. Vitus, people would dance before his statue, a ritual that was meant to ensure a year of good health. But sometimes, this celebratory dancing would become excessive. It would become frenzied, ecstatic, lasting for days. This mania, a strange blend of religious fervor and folk tradition, became known as St. Vitus's dance. Over time, his name also became associated with neurological disorders that caused involuntary jerky movements, conditions we would now recognize as chorea. He became the patron saint of dancers, entertainers, and epileptics, and the one you prayed to when you were afflicted with any malady that made your body move against your will. So, to the terrified minds of 1518, the logic was clear. If this was St. Vitus's dance, then only St. Vitus himself could stop it. Back at the grotto, the priests began the ritual. They led the dancers, or rather, dragged and pushed them, into the dark, echoing cave. Inside, a crude altar stood before a statue of the boy saint. The air was thick with the smell of incense and damp earth. The priests began to chant in Latin, their voices rising and falling in a hypnotic drone, a sound meant to soothe the tormented souls of the afflicted. They sprinkled holy water on the dancers, the cold droplets hitting feverish skin, but the twitching and jerking continued unabated. The families watched from the mouth of the cave, their hands clasped in prayer, their faces etched with a desperate hope. This had to work. It was their last resort. The priests brought out small, carved wooden shoes painted red. These were offerings for the saint. They tried to place them on the dancers' feet, a symbolic act of grounding them, of stopping their infernal motion. But it was impossible. The dancers kicked and stamped, their legs moving with a strength that defied their emaciated frames. The red shoes were kicked away, scattering across the cave floor. Then the priests brought out small wax effigies, tiny dolls meant to represent the afflicted. They held them up, prayed over them, and then in a final desperate act, they placed the dolls into a ritual fire, a symbolic burning away of the sickness. The flames leaped up, casting a hellish orange glow across the cave. The shadows of the dancers grew into monstrous shapes on the walls, a silent, demonic ballet accompanying the priests' holy rites. But nothing happened. The chanting didn't work. The holy water didn't work. The offerings were ignored. The fire burned, but the fever in the dancers' bodies did not. They just kept dancing. A woman collapsed, her heart finally giving out, her body falling limp onto the stone floor right at the feet of St. Vitus's statue. Her husband cried out, a raw animal sound of pure grief that was swallowed by the cavern's acoustics. A terrifying realization began to dawn, first in the eyes of the priests, then spreading like a contagion to the horrified families. Their faith was powerless. The rituals were empty gestures. They had traveled all this way, sacrificed their friends and neighbors on the brutal journey, only to find that their saint was silent. Their God was not listening. They had brought their sick to the holy mountain seeking a cure, but they had found only a cold, damp cave and the echoing sounds of their own failed prayers. This wasn't a divine curse that could be lifted by piety and penance. This was something else. Something darker, more ancient, and utterly immune to their modern faith. They were completely and truly on their own. And as the sun began to set, casting the mountain into a deep purple shadow, a new, more profound fear took hold. If God couldn't save them, who or what would they turn to next? The answer wasn't another prayer. It was a pivot, a desperate, sharp turn away from the heavens that had ignored them, and toward the world of men. If faith had failed, perhaps reason could prevail. The leaders of Strasbourg, the magistrates, the guild masters, the wealthy merchants of the council known as the 21, convened in a state of barely controlled panic. Their city was dying. Their authority was crumbling. And their grand gesture of piety on Mount Savern had been a humiliating, catastrophic failure. They needed a new plan, a new explanation, a new cure. And so they turned to the most educated men they knew, the physicians. This was the dawn of the Renaissance, a time when the shadows of medieval superstition were just beginning to recede before the flickering light of science. The physicians of Strasbourg, draped in their academic robes, represented this new way of thinking. They examined the dancers. They consulted their heavy, leather-bound texts, filled with the wisdom of Galen and Hippocrates. They deliberated, they argued, and they emerged with a diagnosis that was, to them, perfectly logical. It was not demonic possession. It was not a divine curse. It was a natural illness. The affliction, they declared, was caused by hot blood. To understand what they meant, you have to understand their medicine. For over 1,000 years, European medical theory was dominated by the idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A healthy person had these four fluids in perfect balance. But if one humor became too dominant, it would throw the entire system into chaos, causing disease. The dancers, with their flushed faces, their manic energy, their ceaseless motion, were clearly suffering from an overabundance of blood, hot, agitated blood that had risen to their brains, boiling their senses and hijacking their limbs. It sounds absurd to us, but in 1518 this was cutting-edge medical science. And like all science, it came with a prescribed treatment. If the problem was an excess of hot blood, a fever in the very essence of the self, then the cure was simple. You had to let it out. You had to burn it off. The physicians issued their official, professional recommendation to the city council. The afflicted must not be restrained. In fact, they must be encouraged to dance. They needed to dance continuously, day and night, until the fever broke, until the hot blood was exhausted, until they sweated out the sickness and collapsed back into humoral balance. The only way out was through. The city council seized on this diagnosis with the fervor of drowning men grabbing a rope. It was rational. It was modern. It was an actionable plan. And so Strasbourg's leaders committed to one of the most bizarre and deadly public health initiatives in history. They decided to facilitate the plague. They ordered the city's guild halls to be cleared. The Butchers' Guild, the Tanners' Guild, their large open-plan meeting rooms were to be transformed into dance halls. When those filled up, they commandeered the open-air grain market, right in the shadow of the great cathedral. And there, under the stone-faced gaze of the gargoyles who had offered no help, they constructed a large wooden stage. This was to be a city-sponsored dance marathon, a therapeutic rave. But they knew the dancers were already exhausted, their bodies flagging. To keep them moving, to ensure the cure would take, they needed an engine. They needed a beat. So the council hired dozens of professional musicians. Drummers were brought in, their rhythmic pounding echoing off the half-timbered houses. Pipers were paid to play their shrill, hypnotic melodies. Fiddlers and flutists joined the cacophony, creating a relentless, round-the-clock soundtrack for the city's descent into madness. And if the music wasn't enough, they hired healthy, strong men to serve as dance partners. Their job was not one of joy but of brute force. When a dancer stumbled, they were to be lifted up. When their legs buckled, they were to be held upright, their feet still shuffling to the beat. When they collapsed from sheer, agonizing exhaustion, they were to be propped up, their arms and legs moved for them, like grotesque human marionettes, forced to continue the deadly prescription. The stage was set for a cure. What they got was a slaughterhouse. Imagine the scene. A vibrant, upbeat folk tune fills the summer air, a sound of celebration. But the dancers are not celebrating. Their eyes are wide, vacant, staring at nothing. Their clothes are shredded and soaked in sweat. Their feet, wrapped in bloody rags, stomp and shuffle on the wooden boards. Their movements no longer human but jerky, spastic, and uncontrolled. The music is an assault, a relentless whip driving them on. The hired helpers grimly haul the collapsing bodies of their neighbors, their friends, their own family members, forcing them through the motions of a dance they can no longer perform. The hot blood theory was catastrophically wrong. Instead of curing the dancers, the city's prescription was killing them faster. The constant, forced exertion in the sweltering July heat was pushing their bodies far beyond the breaking point. People began to die. Not in the quiet of their homes but in public on the stage in the middle of a song. They died of heart attacks. They died of strokes. They died of pure physical exhaustion, their bodies simply giving out. They would shudder, convulse, and then fall limp. Their lifeless forms quickly dragged off the stage to make room for the next shuffling victim, all while the music played on, never missing a beat. The public spectacle had the opposite of its intended effect. The sight of hundreds of people twitching uncontrollably, surrounded by musicians and paid handlers, didn't calm the public's fears, it amplified them. The plague of suggestion of mass psychogenic illness exploded. Onlookers, drawn in by the morbid curiosity of the music and the spectacle, would stand and watch, mesmerized by the horror. And then one by one they too would begin to feel it. A twitch in the leg, an uncontrollable shudder, and then they would be swept up, as if by an invisible tide, joining the writhing mass on the stage. The cure had become a vector. The hospital had become the morgue. By the middle of August, the death toll was staggering. Some chronicles claim as many as 15 people were dying every single day. The city of Strasbourg was no longer a place of commerce and prayer. It was a theater of the macabre. The very air vibrated with the ceaseless, manic music and the shuffling of dying feet. The leaders of the city watched in abject horror. Their first plan, the appeal to God, had failed. Now their second, the appeal to reason and science, had not only failed but had turned their city into an efficient killing machine. They had taken a crisis and, through their own confident intervention, had engineered a catastrophe. They were out of options. Heaven was silent. Science was a lie. And the dancing, the dying, it just wouldn't stop. The silence that fell over the city council was heavier than any tombstone. Outside, the music had finally blessedly stopped. But the screaming hadn't. The great experiment was over. The stage in the horse market, once a symbol of their confident, rational approach, was now just a platform of death. The guild halls, meant to be places of healing, had become charnel houses. The councilmen, the physicians, the so-called experts who had prescribed more dancing, more music, more celebration, They now had to face the consequences of their hubris. They had looked at a fire and decided the best way to fight it was with gasoline. And now the entire city was an inferno. The death toll, already staggering, was climbing by the hour. 15 people a day had been a crisis. Now, as August scorched the cobblestones, they were losing 30, sometimes 40. The city's cart drivers, once tasked with hauling grain and goods, were now almost exclusively hauling the dead. Pits were being dug outside the city walls, filled with the emaciated, twisted bodies of dancers whose hearts had finally given out. These weren't just numbers. They were neighbors. Shopkeepers, bakers, blacksmiths, mothers, sons. Strasbourg was a city devouring itself, and its own leaders had handed it the knife and fork. Panic curdled into paranoia. If this wasn't a natural disease, then what was it? The physicians, their theories of hot blood, now a tragic joke, quietly slunk back into the shadows. The city council, stripped of their scientific certainty, were left with only one terrifying conclusion. This was not of the body. This was of the soul. This was punishment, a divine scourge, sent from an angry God to punish a wicked city. Their earlier diagnosis had been a symptom of the very disease they were trying to fight, pride. They had tried to solve a heavenly problem with earthly means, and in their arrogance, they had made it infinitely worse. So began the great moral inventory of Strasbourg. The council, desperate to appease the heavens, turned their gaze inward, searching for the sin that had brought this wrath upon them. They started with the obvious targets. New sumptuary laws were passed overnight. Gambling was outlawed. Prostitution was driven from the city with a sudden, violent fervor. Any hint of vice was to be stamped out. They were trying to purify the city, to scrub it clean of the moral stain they believed was fueling the plague. But it was a superficial cleansing, a coat of paint on a rotten house. Because the dancing didn't slow, the dying didn't stop, the city's soul-searching had to go deeper. And that is when they remembered the old stories. The whispers of a saint whose name was inextricably linked with the very affliction that was destroying them. A saint invoked for centuries against convulsions, epilepsy, and the affliction known as chorea. A word that literally meant to dance. They turned their eyes to the hills, to a grotto chapel dedicated to a boy martyr from the ancient Roman world. They turned their prayers to Saint Vitus. Who was this saint? To the people of 1518, he was a figure of immense power. The story, passed down through generations, was one of horrific suffering and divine favor. Vitus was a child, born to a pagan senator in Sicily, who converted to Christianity in secret. When his father discovered his faith, he handed his own son over to the authorities for torture. The boy was scourged, thrown into a dungeon, but his faith never wavered. Legend says lions were released to devour him, but they lay at his feet and licked him like a house cat. He was then, according to the darkest and most vivid parts of the legend, thrown into a cauldron filled with boiling oil, pitch, and lead. But he emerged miraculously unharmed. He was a symbol of enduring faith in the face of unspeakable torment. But there was another, more sinister part to his legend. One story claimed that before his death, Vitus had cursed the Roman Emperor Diocletian, the very man persecuting him, with a dance that he could not stop. Another, more popular tale in the Germanic regions, told of how Vitus himself had been forced to dance before pagan idols as a form of mockery and torture. As a result, he became the patron saint of dancers, entertainers, and those who danced against their will. It was believed he had the power to both inflict and cure uncontrollable movement. He was the divine source of their problem, and therefore, he had to be their only solution. This was it, the answer. The council seized upon it with the fervor of drowning men grabbing for a piece of driftwood. They had been wrong. All wrong. This wasn't hot blood. It was the Vitus dance, Saint Vitus's dance. A curse from the saint himself, perhaps angered by the city's sins, or by some forgotten slight. The cure, therefore, was not more dancing, but its absolute opposite: penance, piety, a desperate appeal for forgiveness. And so, in a stunning reversal that demonstrated the sheer desperation of the situation, the city council issued a new set of edicts. First, all music was banned within the city walls of Strasbourg. The stages were torn down. The musicians, who just days before had been paid handsomely by the city, were now threatened with expulsion if they played a single note. The guild halls were cleared and shuttered. The city that had tried to dance its way out of a plague now enforced a deathly silence. But what to do with the afflicted? They were still writhing in the streets, their bodies jerking to a rhythm only they could hear. They couldn't be left there. The council's new plan was as drastic as it was cruel. If the dancers were cursed by Saint Vitus, then they must be taken to Saint Vitus. They would be forced on a holy pilgrimage. High in the Vosges Mountains, about 30 miles from Strasbourg, near the town of Saverne, was a remote cave shrine carved into the red rock of the hillside. This was the grotto of Saint Vitus. For centuries, pilgrims had traveled there seeking cures for nervous disorders. It was a place of power, a place of last resort. And now it was to be the destination for hundreds of exhausted, starving, and terrified people. The logistics of this new plan were a nightmare. This wasn't a gentle procession. It was an evacuation of the sick and dying. The council ordered wagons to be brought in. Those too weak to stand were to be tied down and carted away. Those who could still walk were to be herded like cattle. Guards were hired to form a perimeter, to keep the dancers moving, to prevent them from collapsing or fleeing. They were to be marched out of the city, through the gates, and onto the dusty road leading into the mountains. Imagine the scene. A city holding its breath as this grotesque parade of the damned was assembled. Families weeping as their loved ones, their faces gaunt, their eyes vacant, were forced into a long stumbling column. Men and women, their limbs still flailing uncontrollably, being pushed and prodded by guards. The only sound was the shuffling of hundreds of worn-out shoes on the cobblestones, the creak of wagon wheels, and the low, animalistic moans of the afflicted. They were being exiled, sent out of the city to seek a miracle or to die in the wilderness, far from sight. As the grim procession shuffled out through the city gates, leaving a trail of dust and despair in its wake, a question hung over Strasbourg. They had put their faith in science and it had led to a massacre. Now they were putting their faith in God, in a boy saint, in a desperate pilgrimage into the mountains. But this act of piety looked disturbingly like a death march. They were sending their sick and dying on a brutal 30-mile journey on foot, to a cold cave in the mountains. Was this an act of sacred healing, or was it the city's final brutal act of washing its hands of a problem it could not solve? Were they marching towards a cure, or simply to a more secluded grave? The journey to the shrine of Saint Vitus was not a procession of the pious. It was a death march disguised as a pilgrimage. Imagine wagons creaking under the weight of human misery, filled with people who could not stop moving. Their limbs, thrashed raw and bloody, continued their phantom dance even as they lay exhausted on beds of straw. Those who could still walk were herded along by guards, their bodies jerking in a grotesque parody of a march, their eyes vacant, locked in a private nightmare. The healthy citizens of Strasbourg watched them go, a mixture of pity and profound relief on their faces. They were casting out their demons, one wagon load at a time. The destination was a cave, a grotto carved into the Vosges Mountains near the town of Saverne, a place of cold stone and dripping water. It was a far cry from the magnificent cathedrals of the city. But this was the chosen sanctuary of Saint Vitus, and for the people of 1518, he was their last and only hope. But who was this saint, whose name would become forever synonymous with this bizarre plague? The story of Vitus is one of faith and horror. A young boy from Sicily, martyred in the year 303 during the brutal persecutions of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. Legend says that as a child, he drove out a demon that had possessed the emperor's own son. But his faith made him an enemy of the state. He was arrested, and the Romans, with their characteristic flair for cruelty, tried to kill him in the most theatrical ways imaginable. They threw him into a cauldron of boiling oil and molten lead, but he emerged miraculously unharmed. They then threw him to a starving lion, which refused to attack him and instead licked his feet like a house cat. Frustrated, his torturers finally had him killed. But his legend grew. Because of the way he was said to have convulsed in the boiling oil, or perhaps because of the wild, frenzied celebrations that later took place on his feast day. He became the patron saint of dancers, entertainers, and epileptics. He was the one you prayed to for protection against lightning strikes, animal attacks, and most importantly, any illness that caused convulsions or uncontrolled movements. He was the saint you called upon when your own body betrayed you. In the medieval mind, if a saint had dominion over an affliction, he could not only cure it, but also inflict it. They believed Saint Vitus, in his anger, had cursed the city of Strasbourg, and so to his cold, damp cave they went, to beg for his forgiveness. When the first wagons of dancers arrived, They were not met with medicine, but with ceremony. The priests of the shrine had a very specific ritual prepared, a piece of religious theater designed to shock the system and appease the heavens. The dancers, many barely conscious, were carried or dragged before the altar, a simple wooden carving of the saint. There they were given small wooden crosses to hold, and most strangely, they were forced to put on red shoes. The symbolism was potent. Red, the color of the blood of Christ, a symbol of martyrdom and salvation, but also red, the color of sin, of the devil's temptations. The priests were performing a kind of spiritual exorcism. They sprinkled the dancers with holy water, chanting prayers and incantations, commanding the dancing sickness to leave their bodies. They were made to make offerings, what little money or valuables they had left, placed at the feet of the statue. And then the most incredible thing happened. It worked. One by one, as the ritual was performed, the dancers began to slow. The frantic, endless movements that had plagued them for weeks started to subside. The convulsions lessened. Their limbs, for the first time in what must have felt like an eternity, grew still. Within days, the majority of those brought to the shrine had stopped dancing completely. The news spread back to Strasbourg like wildfire. A miracle had occurred. The curse was lifted. Saint Vitus had forgiven them. But was it really a miracle? Or was it something else? Something that tells us less about the power of saints and more about the astonishing power of the human mind? Let's step back from the supernatural and look at what was actually happening. For weeks, the authorities had tried everything based on their flawed understanding of the problem. The physician's diagnosis of hot blood led to the disastrous prescription of more dancing. The city council's attempt to manage the crisis by building stages and hiring musicians only legitimized the hysteria and amplified it, turning a sickness into a public spectacle. Both of these cures were based on the idea that the plague was a physical phenomenon that needed a physical solution, and both failed spectacularly. The pilgrimage to St. Vitus's shrine was the first solution that addressed the psychology of the plague. Think about it. If this was a mass psychogenic illness, a trance state fueled by extreme stress and a shared belief in a supernatural curse, then the only way to end it was with an equally powerful psychological intervention. The ritual at the shrine was the perfect psychological circuit breaker. It provided a powerful, authoritative narrative of redemption. The dancers were told, "You are cursed by a powerful saint." This gave their suffering a name and a cause. Then they were told, "If you perform this specific sacred act at this specific sacred place, the saint will forgive you and you will be healed." This provided a clear path out of the nightmare. It gave them a sense of agency they hadn't had for weeks. The journey itself, as brutal as it was a crucial part of the cure. It physically removed the sufferers from the supercharged, hysterical environment of Strasbourg. The stages were gone, the crowds of onlookers were gone, the relentless music was gone. They were taken to a quiet, solemn place. The ritual itself, with its crosses, holy water, and symbolic red shoes, was a deeply resonant, highly dramatic act. It was a public and definitive declaration that the crisis was over. For someone trapped in a trance whose mind had essentially been hijacked by fear, this powerful suggestion, administered by the ultimate authority figures of the church, was enough to jolt them back to reality. It was, in essence, a mass placebo effect on an unprecedented scale. The cure wasn't in the holy water. It was in the belief in the holy water. The healing wasn't in the red shoes. It was in the collective conviction that the shoes were a key to salvation. The city authorities and the church, likely by accident, had finally stumbled upon the one thing that could work. They fought a psychological fire not with medicine, but with a bigger, more compelling psychological story. The dancing had stopped. The survivors, weak, emaciated, and broken, were finally still. But the silence that fell over Strasbourg was not one of peace. It was the silence of a graveyard. The plague was over, but the accounting had just begun. How many had died? Who was left? And how does a city, a community, ever recover from a trauma so profound, a memory so deeply bizarre, that it would be whispered about in horror for the next 500 years? The cure had been found, but the scars were just beginning to form. The silence that fell over Strasbourg in September of 1518 must have been more terrifying than the music. For months, the city had been a cacophony of madness. The relentless beat of drums, the screech of pipes, the shuffling, stamping, and collapsing of hundreds of feet. Now there was only the wind whistling through empty market squares and the hollow sound of grief. The stages in the guild halls were dismantled. The musicians, their grim work done, were paid and sent away. The last of the dancers, the ones who had somehow survived, were carried from the mountain shrines, their bodies broken, their minds vacant. But as the physical tremors of the plague ceased, a deeper psychological earthquake had just begun. How does a society process an event that defies all logic? For the people of Strasbourg, the world had been turned upside down. The fundamental laws of nature, of God, of the human body itself seemed to have been suspended. They were left with a city of ghosts. Husbands without wives, children without parents. Businesses were shuttered, their owners having danced their livelihoods into the grave. Fields lay fallow, their farmers having traded the harvest for a frenzied, fatal waltz. The economic toll was staggering, but it was nothing compared to the spiritual and mental wreckage. The survivors walked the streets looking at their neighbors with a new kind of suspicion, a new kind of fear. Could it happen again? Was the madness still lurking in the blood, in the air, waiting for the right moment to erupt? In the absence of answers, humanity does what it has always done. It creates them. The search for meaning, for a reason behind the horror, became the city's next obsession. And in the early 16th century, all roads of explanation led first to God. The sermons that followed the plague were filled with fire and brimstone. This, the priests thundered from the pulpits of the great cathedral, was divine retribution. It was the wrath of a scorned and angry God, punishing Strasbourg for its sins. And there were so many sins to choose from: greed, vanity, blasphemy, adultery. Preachers pointed to the city's growing wealth, the fashionable clothes of its citizens, the perceived lack of piety. The dancing, they argued, was a grotesque parody of holy worship, a demonic inversion of spiritual ecstasy. The dancers weren't victims. They were perpetrators of a collective sin so great that God had made their bodies the instruments of their own destruction. For many, this was a comforting, if terrifying, explanation. It gave the chaos a purpose. It was a warning: repent or face a far worse fate in the hereafter. But for others, the hand of God felt too distant, too abstract. The horror they had witnessed felt more intimate, more sinister. They looked not to the heavens for a cause, but to the shadows. They whispered of witchcraft, of curses laid upon the city by some hidden enemy. Had someone made a pact with the devil? Was this his infernal music they had all heard? This explanation gained traction because it offered a tangible villain. It wasn't about an abstract concept like sin. It was about a specific, malicious act. People began to eye their neighbors with renewed suspicion. The old woman at the edge of town, the one who sold strange herbs, the man whose business rival had suddenly prospered. A curse could explain the randomness, why one person was afflicted and another spared. It was a way of containing the terror, of putting a human or inhuman face on it. The invocation of Saint Vitus, originally a plea for divine help, now took on the darker tone of an exorcism, a battle against a very real, very present demonic force that had seized control of their loved ones. Yet, even in 1518, not everyone was satisfied with supernatural explanations. The city's elite, its physicians, its scholars, its magistrates, attempted to find a cause within the realm of the natural world. Their science was, by our standards, rudimentary, a blend of ancient Greek theory and folk medicine, but it was a rational attempt nonetheless. The prevailing medical theory, championed by the city's physicians and later echoed by the famous alchemist and Dr. Paracelsus, was the theory of hot blood. They believed the human body was governed by 4 humors, and that an imbalance could lead to disease. In this case, they argued, the brains of the afflicted had become overheated. Their blood had literally begun to boil with a hot, choleric humor, compelling their limbs to move uncontrollably. This, they reasoned, was why their initial prescription was more dancing. They believed the victims needed to dance out the fever, to exhaust the hot humor until balance was restored. Other natural theories were floated as well. Some looked to the sky, blaming a malevolent alignment of the stars and planets, an astrological event that had poisoned the minds of the vulnerable. Others looked to the ground, suggesting that strange vapors or a miasma had risen from the earth and induced the mania. These theories may seem fantastical to us now, but they represented a crucial shift in thinking. They were an attempt to diagnose the plague not as a spiritual failing, but as a physical or environmental ailment. They were wrong, of course, but they were searching for a mechanism. They were looking for a poison, a pathogen, a tangible cause in a world they could see and touch. They were, in their own way, practicing science, But as the weeks turned into months, and the city began the slow, painful process of rebuilding, none of these explanations truly held. The divine punishment theory couldn't explain why the pious and the sinner had danced side by side. The demonic possession theory couldn't explain why the exorcisms at the mountain shrines had been so brutally, physically fatal. And the natural theories like hot blood or bad air couldn't explain the most baffling part of it all, how the affliction had spread from one person to another, seemingly by sight alone. It was a disease that jumped from mind to mind, a contagion of the soul. The official story, the one the City Council of Strasbourg desperately wanted to promote, was one of a bizarre but contained incident. They commissioned chronicles that recorded the events, but often framed them in a way that protected the city's reputation and their own authority. They highlighted the piety of their response, their charity in caring for the dancers, while subtly blaming the victims themselves, calling them weak-minded, melancholic, or overly imaginative. The plague became a historical anecdote, a strange footnote in the city's records. But on the streets it became a legend, a ghost story told to frighten children, a traumatic memory that festered in the collective unconscious of the city for generations. They had survived, but they had no idea what they had survived. The event was simply too strange, too far outside the boundaries of their understanding, to be properly integrated into their history. It remained a terrifying anomaly, a moment when the world simply stopped making sense. And for the next 500 years, the real cause would remain a mystery, a puzzle waiting for a new era of understanding. A new science that could finally unlock the darkest corners of the human mind and explain how a single woman's dance could bring an entire city to its knees. And so, as the last exhausted dancer finally collapsed and the eerie silence fell over Strasbourg, the real horror began. It wasn't the horror of noise and chaos, but of the quiet aftermath, the questions. The city was left to count its dead, to tend to the broken, and to grapple with an event that defied all logic. The music had stopped, but the mystery was just beginning to play its haunting tune, a melody that would echo for centuries. For the people of Strasbourg, the explanation was a matter of faith and fear. This was the work of Saint Vitus, a vengeful saint punishing them for their sins. Or perhaps it was demonic, a dark ritual played out on a city-wide stage. These were the answers of a world lit by firelight, a world where the supernatural was as real as the bread they couldn't afford. The official explanation, the theory of hot blood, put forth by the city's physicians, was a desperate attempt to apply their limited science to an incomprehensible phenomenon. But even they must have known deep down that this was something more, something that couldn't be bled out or cooled with herbs. As the years turned into decades and decades into centuries, the dancing plague became a dark fairy tale, a bizarre footnote in the annals of history, a story so strange it felt like fiction. But science, unlike stories, is a relentless detective, and in the 19th and 20th centuries, it returned to the cold case of 1518, armed with new tools and new theories. The first major breakthrough seemed to come from the fields themselves. A suspect emerged, a tiny, insidious fungus called ergot. This fungus grows on rye, the staple grain of the poor in medieval Europe. And when ingested, ergot is poison. It causes a condition called ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire. The symptoms? Muscle spasms, convulsions, delirium, and terrifying hallucinations. In fact, the hallucinogenic drug LSD is derived from this very fungus. For a while, this seemed to be the perfect answer. A biological smoking gun. The people of Strasbourg weren't mad. They were poisoned. They had eaten tainted bread. And the fungus had hijacked their nervous systems, forcing them to dance. It was a neat scientific explanation that put the old superstitions to bed. But the more scientists looked, the more the theory fell apart. The symptoms didn't quite line up. Ergotism often causes gangrene, turning limbs black and leading to amputation. Nobody in Strasbourg reported this. Ergotism causes violent, jerky seizures, not the coordinated, almost purposeful dancing that was described for days on end. And most damning of all, how could a batch of poisoned rye affect 400 people, but not the thousands of others eating from the same grain supply? Why did it spread from person to person as if by sight? The poison theory, as clean as it was, just didn't fit the facts. The detective was back to square one. The real answer, the one that is now widely accepted, was far more unsettling, because it suggested the culprit wasn't a fungus in their bread or a demon in their souls. The culprit was in their own minds. To understand the dancing plague, we have to look beyond medicine and biology and into the terrifying power of human psychology. We have to look at the world of 1518 not as a history book, but as a pressure cooker. Imagine living in Strasbourg at that time. It wasn't a fairy tale kingdom. It was a place of profound misery. A series of brutal famines had ravaged the land, leaving the population starving and desperate. Disease was rampant. The Black Death was a recent living memory. Syphilis, a new and terrifying illness, was sweeping across Europe. Leprosy was common. The streets were filled with the sick, the dying, and the destitute. On top of this, the political and religious landscape was in turmoil. The Protestant Reformation was just beginning, creating deep social and spiritual anxiety. People truly believed that God was angry, that the world was ending, and that their very souls were in peril. This was a population stretched to its absolute limit, living under a level of chronic, inescapable stress that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. Their bodies and minds were drowning in the stress hormone cortisol. They were a bundle of raw nerves, a forest floor covered in dry tinder, waiting for a single spark. That spark was Frau Trophia. When she stepped into the street and began to dance, her bizarre, desperate act resonated with the silent, screaming anxiety of everyone who saw her. This is the foundation of what is now called mass psychogenic illness, or MPI. It's a phenomenon where physical symptoms, with no known organic cause, spread rapidly through a group of people. It's not faking. The suffering is real. The body begins to manifest the mind's unbearable stress. In a community that was deeply superstitious, that believed in divine curses and demonic possession, a public unexplained trance state was a powerful and terrifying suggestion. When the first few people joined Frau Trophia, they weren't just imitating her. Their own stressed-out minds, already primed for disaster, saw her behavior as a potential reality for themselves. The psychological barrier between seeing and experiencing began to dissolve. And then the authorities made their catastrophic mistake. In their attempt to help, they did the one thing that could turn a small outbreak into a full-blown epidemic. They legitimized it. By moving the dancers to the guild halls, by building a stage in the market square, by hiring musicians and paying professional dancers to join in, they sent a clear message to the entire city. This is a real phenomenon. This is something that happens. They essentially created a socially sanctioned outlet for the collective panic. They put the hysteria on a pedestal and gave it a soundtrack. This is the crucial mechanism of social contagion. The more people who saw the dancing, the more people who saw it being treated as a real, uncontrollable affliction by the city leaders, the more susceptible they became. It became an escape valve for all the pent-up terror, starvation, and grief. The conscious mind might have been horrified, but the subconscious mind saw a way to express its agony. The dance was a fever of the soul made visible. People didn't choose to dance. They were swallowed by a wave of collective psychological collapse. They danced because, in a world that offered no other escape, their minds broke in a way that forced their bodies to move. The dancing plague of 1518 wasn't caused by a poison, a curse, or a disease in the traditional sense. It was an epidemic of despair, a testament to the fact that the mind, under enough pressure, can and will force the body to act out its trauma. The dancers of Strasbourg weren't mad. They were heartbroken, terrified, and starving, and they lived in a world that gave them only one lens through which to understand their suffering: the supernatural. Their dance was a physical manifestation of a psychological scream. And what can we learn from this today? The story of the dancing plague is more than just a historical curiosity. It is a profound and chilling cautionary tale. It reminds us that social contagion is real. In our modern world of social media and instant information, ideas and emotions, and even physical symptoms, can spread through a population with terrifying speed. It also serves as a stark reminder of the devastating link between mental and physical health. The people of Strasbourg weren't weak. They were unsupported. Their suffering was invisible until it exploded into the streets in a grotesque, unstoppable ballet. The town that danced itself to death is a monument to the forgotten victims of stress, poverty, and fear. Their bodies finally gave out from exhaustion and heart attacks, but the true cause of death was a world that had become too cruel to bear. They weren't dancing for joy. They were dancing to escape. And in the end, for many, the only escape they found was death. Their silent screams echo from 1518 to remind us that societies, just like people, can be pushed past their breaking point. and that the mind is a place of mysteries far deeper and darker than any ancient curse.